Christmas Day, 1914. The first Christmas of World War I. British and German troops have risen from their trenches, only this time without weapons in their hands. Despite the state of war between them, both sides have decided to share the festivities together. How did this happen? Let's find out. The first few months of World War I were a frenetic time, a clash between two mighty powers, France and Germany. Both had their plans for decisive victory. The Germans planned to swoop around Belgium and into northern France, aiming for Paris, while the French aimed to drive into their lost provinces in Alsace-Lorraine, which were now in German hands. None of this happens. What does happen is everything goes wrong for everyone. Facing a war on two fronts, German strategy is to quickly knock France out of the war in a rapid campaign to allow them to shift their forces east and deal with Russia. Things begin okay for Germany. They do advance into French territory via the Low Countries, but their grand plan stalls at the River Marne after a French and British counterattack drives them back. And so ends the first months of World War I, a time of rapid movement and open warfare. A very different image from what we often associate with the Great War. Unable to defeat each other, soldiers on both sides begin to dig in, and so begins the notorious trench warfare. A long war of attrition, with neither side being able to outflank the other. As time goes on, the trenches join up and gradually a front line emerges. France, however, is now desperate to end the war. It is being fought on their land after all, and as a result, they continue to launch massive attacks against the Germans in the first weeks of December. Over 250,000 men are thrown at the German army. The French are fighting to win. They're determined to break the German lines and get back to open warfare, but they're ultimately unable to advance. By late December, the attacks and counterattacks gradually subside. Both sides seemingly resign to the reality that they can't get the better of each other, and the front line becomes quiet. As was common in warfare, both sides would now have to wait out the winter. The trenches themselves were basic. There were certainly no front or reserve lines at this point, and life for the poor soldiers in them was bleak. For men on both sides, it was a miserable experience, surrounded by disease, the stress of combat, corpses lying everywhere, and the constant thought that death could strike at any moment. It was a far cry from the start of the war, just a few months earlier, where soldiers had marched off in high spirits, assuming the war would be over by Christmas. Now it is Christmas, and it's clear to the average soldier on both sides that this war isn't ending anytime soon. And if you're a soldier, that means there's no end in sight to your misery, no end to the freezing nights, no end to your endless misfortune. A longing for things to be over and to be back home at Christmas. But it was this misfortune that both sides shared. All began to see their hardships grow, and were in some places dug in as little as 30 metres from each other. Then the frost comes, the mud freezes over, and the worry of attack grows. But the Germans, far from fighting, begin singing Christmas carols and setting up Christmas trees on the eve of Christmas. The British are suspicious, but they're also intrigued. Marmaduke Walkington of the Queen's Westminster Rifles remembers. "We were in the front line. We were about 300 yards from the Germans, and we had, I think on Christmas Eve, we'd been singing carols, and this, that and the other, and the Germans had been doing the same, and we'd been shouting to each other. Eventually a German said, 'Tomorrow, you no shoot, we no shoot.' The British continue to applaud the German renditions of popular carols and call out to them. Sometimes humorous remarks, sometimes rude, but more importantly, both sides continue to soften their guard. They all share a deep cultural bond, and they all want to be celebrating Christmas at home, and this leads to understanding and empathy. British Field Marshal John French, however, is not happy. He'd become increasingly concerned throughout December of the somewhat hands-off approach displayed by many of his troops. Morale was waning, the war was looking uncertain, and consequently he ordered no unofficial truce would be tolerated. However, in other sections, officers did form agreements on the eve of Christmas to indeed cease hostilities the following day, with officers sometimes even meeting at the wire. On Christmas morning, as dawn breaks, the first soldiers begin arising from the trenches. It's got to be remembered that simply arising above the trench was a death sentence. It took incredible bravery and trust. All the more interesting, of course, as the soldiers don't trust each other. Some soldiers are killed in this endeavour, but as more brave soldiers walk into no man's land, the feelings of suspicion and fear subside. The truce itself varied along the front lines. In some cases, it was just a ceasefire, merely arranged to simply remove bodies and repair trenches. For example, in Flanders, trenches were particularly prone to flooding, and in some cases they collapsed altogether. In many other cases, there was no truce. One well-known example of this is when British soldiers opened fire, shooting down all the German Christmas trees while the Germans continued with the celebration. But throughout the front lines, on Christmas morning, soldiers were indeed laying down their arms in multiple sectors. Here we see a photograph of Arno Bohm, a German soldier pictured alongside British troops during the truce. It was this picture and other pictures like it that began to circulate in the British press to an astonished public. Much of the British public believed it to be a myth. Government and media had fed propaganda about the Germans being bloodthirsty animals, capable of anything, and now letters from the hands of the soldiers painted an entirely different picture. The soldiers who returned home from the front have since told their tales. The tales vary for a variety of reasons, and consequently we have many varying and fascinating tales from the event itself. Harold Lewis of the Royal Field Artillery, 240th Brigade, claims the event has been wildly exaggerated. He says, "Though it would be arrogant to say that the thing didn't actually take place, I very much doubt whether anything of the nature or magnitude that has been claimed for it took place at all. I think the whole thing borders on a fairy tale." However, Ernie Williams of the 6th Battalion, Cheshire Regiment, would recount a different experience. He would say, "We shared fags and goodies with the Germans, and then, from somewhere, somehow, this football appeared. It was a proper football, but we didn't form a team. It wasn't a team game in any sense of the word. You know, it was a kickabout. Everyone was having a go." He would also go on to say that a couple of hundred men were playing, and that he himself had a good crack at it, being pretty good at the time, just 19 years old. So that's the thing, the truce will have varied. Some soldiers may have longed to shake the hands of their foes, while others would have been against it, seeing many of their friends dead. Others would have been suspicious, while others would have been confused. All understandable reactions, and regardless of what individuals thought or did, it must never be forgotten how awful it would have been for them out there. The truce may not have always been the fairy tale image we think of, with soldiers actually burying the bodies of their dead comrades. But the fact that soldiers did indeed lay down their arms that Christmas and celebrate the festivities together, despite being in a state of war, is astonishing in itself. Truces were common in warfare, they always have been, both sides often using it as time to regroup and bury the dead. But the Christmas truce of 1914 was different, as both sides along the front spontaneously adopted the same spirit. A mixture of shared culture, empathy, Christmas spirit, and fellowship. The truce was certainly of its time. It was early in the war. It didn't end the war, in fact it was insignificant. The following year things would take a very dark turn. The war would go on to be one of the deadliest in history, but the truce wasn't an end, but a blip. But during that blip, many soldiers wrote back and felt that in that short period, it did indeed feel like peace had been declared.